Okay, let's unpack this.
Today, we're diving into something, well, something pretty ambitious. It's a synthesis that tries to bridge some of the biggest gaps in science.
It really is. We're talking about connecting hard physics like the laws of thermodynamics with the most advanced, almost sci-fi level modeling of what conscious experience actually is.
That's the one. Our sources lay out this new integrated framework. It's called the Biodynamics of Consciousness, or BDC for short.
And what's so radical about it is that it's not just another philosophical take on consciousness. It's trying to formally link our inner experience of suffering to, well, to energy itself using
Right.
testable principles.
Exactly. It pulls together evolutionary biology, modern neuroscience, and then, thousands of years of human insight from contemplative practices. And the real kicker is how we're linking it to this other totally independent mathematical model.
The Phenomenal Manifold Hypothesis, or PMH, and that comes from Eric Race, right? A heavy-duty physics approach.
That's it. So our mission for this deep dive is to synthesize these two massive ideas. Because what they promise, if they hold up, is a kind of aha moment. A single, unified way of looking at the human condition through the lens of biology, physics, and psychology all at once.
And the payoff they're aiming for isn't just academic. It's about practical tools, things we can use to tackle, the huge existential crises of modern life.
The stakes are incredibly high. The authors we're drawing from argue that we're at this massive inflection point.
Where these three huge domains are finally converging: evolutionary biology, neuropsychoanalysis, and contemplative science.
And they all point to one.
Mhm.
Well, one really provocative claim, which is that the vast majority of human suffering is, in a word, optional.
That is a staggering claim. And honestly, that's where my skepticism immediately kicks in. I mean, how can they possibly say that?
Sounds dismissive, I know.
Yeah, it sounds like it minimizes real, genuine suffering. Losing someone you love, chronic illness, real poverty. How do they get around the idea that they're just, I don't know, pathologizing normal human sadness?
That is the absolute core coffin. And the answer is that they don't minimize it at all. They get incredibly rigorous about distinguishing between two fundamentally different types of conflict.
Okay.
If your suffering comes from what they call type 1, it's unavoidable. It's part of being alive.
Yeah.
But if it comes from type 2, well, they argue that it is chemically, geometrically, and functionally optional.
And to get that distinction, we have to start at the very beginning.
At the absolute foundation, we have to start with physics.
So this is the first pillar of the whole framework, the raw physics of existence. They call it biothermodynamics.
Exactly. And the foundational principle is actually pretty simple. It's that all life, everything we are and everything we do, operates under the absolute non-negotiable constraints of the laws of thermodynamics.
Specifically the second law, the one that says the universe is always, always moving toward a state of greater disorder, of entropy.
Right. Everything tends to fall apart. And life itself, whether it's a single cell or, a global economy, is defined as this temporary, localized struggle against that cosmic decay. We're like little islands of order in a giant sea of chaos.
And that struggle isn't free. It has a physical cost. To maintain that little pocket of organization, you need three things, no exceptions.
Right. You need a constant flow of high-quality energy, you need raw materials to build with, and you need a way to pump out the disorder you're creating.
Which is usually waste heat. You have to pay the entropy bill.
You always have to pay the bill. So when you take that need for finite resources, energy, matter, and you put it in a finite environment like planet Earth,
The result is unavoidable.
competition.
Competition. It's not a moral choice. It's not a philosophy. It is a physical necessity dictated by energy gradients. It's just baked into the system.
And that necessity is what drove evolution into, as you said, hyperspeed. The sources really zeroes in on one particular innovation that changed everything.
Predation, the act of consuming other living things. Eating these little pre-organized energy packets.
It's a massive metabolic shortcut. Instead of building complexity from scratch, you just steal it. And this is what kicked off those famous evolutionary arms races. Better muscles to run, sharper eyes to see.
And eventually, our enormous energy-hungry brains.
Exactly. So that fundamental struggle for limited resources, the competition dictated by thermodynamics, that's what the framework defines as material conflict or type 1 conflict.
Okay, step one. It's structural, it's physical, it's been going on for nearly 4 billion years. You can't just wish it away.
You can't. But this is where the whole story pivots. Because now we move to the second pillar, the emergence of the self model, seen through neuropsychology.
So that type 1 arms race gave us these increasingly complex brains, right? Brains designed to model the outside world so we could get better at finding food and not becoming food.
Precisely. But then, in higher primates, something really strange happened. That massive, metabolically expensive brain pointed its modeling capacity inward. It started modeling itself.
Autoreference, the birth of what we call the self.
And the sources give this really neat layered model of how that self evolved. Level 0 is just the physical boundary. Skin, a cell membrane, the line between me and not me.
Simple enough.
Then you get level 1, which you see in most mammals. That's the internal body map. Homeostasis, knowing where your limbs are in space. Proprioception.
Level 2 is the famous mirror test, right? Visual self-recognition, apes, dolphins.
Correct. But level 3 is the great human leap, and it's the most expensive one. It's the symbolic narrative self.
So this isn't a physical thing at all. This is the story of who I am.
The abstract construction. I am a competent professional. I'm a good father. I'm a respected member of my community. I belong to this political tribe. It's a story we tell ourselves.
And you said this level 3 self is expensive, like the most expensive thing in the known universe.
Metabolically speaking, you could argue that. The human brain, as you know, uses about 20% of our total body energy, even though it's only 2% of our mass.
An incredible energy hog.
A huge one. And the sources emphasize that a massive portion of that energy, especially when we're just daydreaming or not focused on a task, is burned by one specific brain network, the default mode network, or DMN.
The DMN, the brain's internal PR machine. That's a great way to put it.
It really is. It's the part of the brain that runs that symbolic narrative, 2147. It's constantly processing our social status, rehearsing future conversations, replaying past failures, comparing ourselves to others.
And crucially, defending that level 3 self-image relentlessly.
And that brings us right to the definition of the second type of conflict, psychological conflict, or type 2 conflict. This emerges when that self-modeling system starts treating the model, the story of you, as if it were a real physical thing that's under constant threat.
Even when the actual physical body is perfectly safe.
Especially when the body is perfectly safe.
Okay, this distinction is everything. We need to ground this in a real example. The sources use a leopard.
Right. A leopard goes on a hunt. It fails. That's a type 1 conflict. It physically failed to get the energy it needed. But what happens next?
Nothing. The conflict ends the second the gazelle gets away. The leopard just walks off. It doesn't sit there for 3 days thinking, I'm a terrible leopard. What will the other leopards think?
Exactly. Now contrast that with a human. You're in a climate-controlled office. You're physically safe. You've got food in the fridge. But you get a critical email from your boss. There is zero type 1 threat. Your body is fine.
But the type 2 conflict explodes. I'm incompetent. I'm going to get fired. My reputation is ruined.
And because the threat is symbolic, it's a threat to that level 3 narrative, not to your levels of your kin, the conflict doesn't just end. It ruminates for days, weeks, even years.
And all that time, the DMN is demanding energy, what they call defensive energy, to run all those internal arguments and defend the story of me. That's the difference. Physical necessity versus, well, psychological choice.
And that functional distinction brings us to the third pillar, contemplative science.
The idea that for centuries, people have intuitively understood that this self-model isn't fixed, it's malleable.
And now modern science is confirming it. We can see that the autoreferential structure, the self, can be temporarily or even permanently modified through specific replicable training protocols.
The data on this is really starting to pile up, isn't it?
It's incredibly compelling. You can put experienced meditators in an fMRI scanner and see in real time a reduction of activity in the DMN.
And when they report those experiences of dissolution of the self or non-dual awareness, you can actually see the correlated shutdown in the specific brain regions responsible for the self-narrative.
The temporoparietal junction, the posterior cingulate cortex, the lights literally dim in the headquarters of the ego.
And this isn't just a temporary state, like a vacation for the ego. The long-term studies are even more wild.
They are. Practitioners with, say, 10,000 plus hours of training show permanent structural changes in their brains. They show significantly less emotional reactivity. They can handle a stressful situation, but without all the psychological drama.
But, and this is the critical part, their functional capacity to solve real type 1 problems isn't just intact, it often gets better.
It improves because they're not wasting energy on the drama. So the radical discovery here is that the self isn't some solid, unchanging thing. It's a high-energy, observable, emergent process.
And just the act of observing that process without judging it has measurable objective effects on the brain that reduce suffering and the metabolic load.
So putting it all together, the biodynamics of consciousness argues that we operate in three distinct domains at the same time, and each has different rules.
First, the physical biological domain,
Yeah.
governed by thermodynamics and evolution. Here, conflict is structural and it's inevitable. Modifiability is very low. You can't just decide to stop aging.
Second, the neuropsychological domain, governed by system dynamics information processing. Here, conflict is emergent and it's contingent. It arises from that DMN. So modifiability is medium. It takes work, like therapy or specific training.
And third, the conscious phenomenological domain, or actual felt experience. Here, conflict is entirely optional. That depends 100% on whether we identify with that symbolic self-model. So modifiability is high. It's accessible through direct protocols.
And the key insight, the one that changes the whole game, is that these layers can be dissociated.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning that just because you have to deal with entropy and scarcity type 1, that doesn't mean you are doomed to fight the chronic internal war of defending your reputation type 2.
The two things are highly correlated in most people's lives right now.
But that correlation is a bug, not a feature. The framework argues it is not inevitable.
Okay, so if this self-model is this high-energy process, we have to talk about that cost. The sources actually try to quantify it with what they call the equations of existence.
They do. They break down the total energy consumption of a human being, which they call E-total.
And it has three parts. First is E-basal, right? Just basic metabolism, keeping the lights on, the heart beating.
Correct. Second is E-functional one. This is the energy you spend on actual cognitive tasks, solving real-world type 1 problems, designing a bridge, finding food, writing code.
And then there's the third critical term, E-defensive goal.
The energy dedicated solely to maintaining, defending, and comparing that level 3 narrative self-model.
And the central, frankly terrifying hypothesis here is that for many modern humans, a defensive view is often greater than a functional.
Think about that. We are spending more of our precious cognitive energy defending a fragile self-image in abstract social hierarchies than we are spending on actually solving the real problems in front of us.
This is what they formalize as the costliness of the self. It's their theorema, too. The energy cost of the self is directly proportional to the gap between your self-model and your direct experience.
It's such a powerful idea. If your internal story is, I am a calm, organized, successful person, but your direct experience is a mountain of debt, a chaotic schedule, and a short temper, your brain has to burn a massive amount of glucose just to manage that contradiction.
It's actively filtering reality, generating excuses, running counter-arguments, all to protect the story.
That cognitive dissonance has a real metabolic cost. That cost is a defensive ego.
And this leads to another key idea, what they call the overlap of sufferings, or theorem of 5, that total human suffering isn't just type 1 plus type 2.
Right. There's a non-linear interaction term. The two amplify each other. And in the modern world, that interaction term often dominates everything.
Which explains the great paradox of modernity, doesn't it? We solve so many type 1 problems. We have better healthcare, safer cities, more food than ever before. But solving those material problems gives us diminishing returns on well-being.
Because the type 2 internal conflict, that interaction term, is left untouched. Or, in many cases, it's actually amplified by the modern world. We are physically safer and more comfortable than any humans in history, but we're psychologically exhausted.
So this is their integrated diagnosis for the crisis of modernity. We've accidentally engineered an environment that is perfect for pushing type 2 conflict into a chronic overdrive state.
A state that's completely disconnected from any actual physical threat.
And the sources are really specific about the amplifiers. They list 4 key ones. The first is, well, it's the most obvious one, hypersocial comparison.
Absolutely. Our brains evolved in small tribes of maybe 150 people. Your level 3 self-model had to manage its status within that small local group.
But now social media exposes our self-model to literally millions of competitors every single day. And they're all showing us their perfectly curated highlight reels.
So the DMN, which was designed for a village, is now trying to run a status calculation on a global scale. It's completely overwhelmed.
The second amplifier is infinite status and security. In the ancestral world, hierarchies were, relatively stable.
But modern hierarchies are constantly shifting, expanding, and multiplying. You could be the top performer on your team, but the internet will instantly show you 100 people your age who just raised $50 million or have 1 million followers.
There's no finish line. There's no point at which your status defense system gets to turn off and rest. It's designed to be a perpetual motion machine of anxiety.
which guarantees that E defensive never gets to drop to zero.
Third, they point to entire industries built on what they call the self-optimizing narrative.
The self-help industry, advertising, wellness culture, a lot of it is built on the premise that your fundamental self is flawed, that it's not enough, and that it needs constant improvement.
Which you can achieve by buying their product or following their program.
And if the cost of the self is proportional to the gap between your ideal self and your real self, these industries work by deliberately making that gap wider. They engineer discrepancy to guarantee a continuous high level of assurance of it.
And the last amplifier is disconnection from direct experience.
We live in our heads. We live in a constant state of conceptual simulation. We're planning, worrying, scrolling, rehearsing arguments, ruminating on the past. We're almost never just in the immediate, sensory, embodied present moment.
When you're truly present, you're in type 1 reality. Physical sensations, the constraints of the world. But when you're ruminating, you're in type 2 reality, the symbolic narrative.
And the modern environment is an engine for maximizing that type 2 simulation time. It keeps A defensifical high in the rumination, even when you're just lying in bed at night.
So we're burning all this psychic fuel, defending these fragile, abstract identities in a world that, materially, is safer than it's ever been. It's a kind of internal metabolic crisis.
Which takes us back to those crucial theorems. Kirima 1, dissociability of conflicts.
Yeah.
This is the practical payoff. Let's say you lose your job. That is a real, functional type 1 problem.
You need an income. That's a material reality.
Right, and it requires a functional, material solution. Updating your resume, networking, applying for jobs. But it only becomes a paralyzing existential crisis, a type 2 problem, if you identify the event with your level 3 self. I am a failure.
My identity is shattered. The framework insists you can have the functional problem without the existential drama.
Exactly. Then there's the more mind-bending one. Theorema 3, transitivity of observation. The idea that when a system observes itself, the observer and the observed are part of the same process.
This gets at that core illusion, doesn't it? That there's a solid, stable I in here that is watching my thoughts go by.
When in reality, the thinking process itself retroactively creates the feeling of a separate thinker. If you actually try to look for the thinker, all you find is more thinking. There's no one home.
And finally, Theorema 4, reversibility of autoreference. This is the one that really challenges a lot of classical psychology.
It does. The old model was that a strong, well-defined, rigid ego was the cornerstone of mental health. This framework argues for the exact opposite.
That states with a reduced or even temporarily absent self-model like flow states or deep meditation are not pathological. They often increase your functional capacity.
A flexible, reducible ego is the hallmark of mental health, not a rigid, heavily defended one.
Okay, the real power of this framework, I think, for anyone listening, is that it doesn't just stop at theory, it's prescriptive. It offers these concrete, testable protocols for hacking the DMN and cutting that chronic cost of type 2 conflict.
Right, they're all designed to do one thing.
Yeah.
Dissociate type 1 and type 2 conflicts in your own direct experience, and by doing so, functionally lower your
Protocol 1 is the starting block. It's called conflict dissociation training.
And the goal is simple. It's to learn experimentally in your own body the difference between a real physical threat and a narrative threat.
How does that work in practice? Like when you're actually feeling stressed or angry?
You run a series of reality check questions. First, is there an immediate physical threat to my body right now? In 99% of modern life, the answer is no.
So if no, the next question is, okay, what exactly is being threatened here?
And the answer will always be an abstraction. My reputation, my sense of competence, my idea of what's fair, a piece of the level 3 narrative.
Then the next step, does this threatened story have any physical existence? Can I put it on a scale and weigh it? Which is, of course, no. And finally,
what functional action can I take right now if I simply stop spending energy defending this story?
And the idea is that this short-circuits the emotional hijacking. You can respond to the situation functionally instead of reacting defensively.
And the success metric is physiological. You can measure it. A reduction in heart rate, a change in skin conductance, plus a subjective increase in cognitive clarity. The resources that we're going to defense are now available for problem solving.
But I have to ask, isn't this just a very sophisticated form of self-help? How do you stop yourself from just creating a new type 2 conflict? The story of, I'm the kind of person who's great at solving type 1 problems and never gets emotional.
That is a brilliant and essential question,
Yeah.
and the framework anticipates it. That's why Protocol 1 is insufficient on its own. It has to be integrated with Protocol 2.
Which is non-reactive observation. This is the skill from contemplative traditions, but stripped of any dogma.
Exactly. The goal here is not just to be more functional, but to develop the raw capacity to be with your experience, thoughts, feelings, sensations, without automatically adding that layer of self-referential interpretation.
So you focus on an anchor, like the breath. A thought comes up, and instead of getting lost in the content of the thought,
You just note its structure. A thought about work has arisen, and you notice the implicit I that wants to claim ownership of that thought. And then, gently, you return your attention to direct sensation, without judging yourself for having the thought in the first place.
and it's crucial to stress, this is not about spacing out or relaxing. This is highly alert, focused attention. It's actively withdrawing metabolic resources from the DMN's loops. It is work.
It is e-functional, not e-defensible. And again, we can measure it. We see the DMN quiet down in fMRI scans. We see changes in EEG patterns, more global synchronization. And behaviorally, people's response times get faster because there's less self-referential gunk in the gears.
So next up is Protocol 3, direct material engagement. This is about practicing solving type 1 problems without letting the type 2 machine turn on.
It's about defining success in purely functional terms, completely separate from ego. So if the problem is financial debt, the functional outcome is reduce the principal by X amount. It is not regain my status as a successful provider.
And the real test is how you process failure, isn't it?
That's the whole game. If you try a solution and it fails, with type 2, the internal story is, I'm a failure, this is hopeless, I should just give up. It's paralyzing.
But without type 2, the analysis is purely functional. Okay, that variable didn't work. I now have new data. Let's adjust the approach and test the next hypothesis. The energy stays focused on the problem, not on the self.
Then there's Protocol 4, which is about tackling the external environment, redesign of the informational environment.
Because if modern type 2 conflict is fueled by all this hyper-comparison, you have to manage the inputs.
It's a conscious audit. You have to aggressively identify and reduce your exposure to the sources that are constantly feeding that self-model. Social media feeds, certain news channels, maybe even certain competitive social groups.
And the sources recommend not just cutting back, but actively substituting. Replacing that time with direct experience, walking, making something with your hands, having a real conversation.
And we know this works. The digital detox studies show pretty dramatic drops in anxiety and depression. But, and this is a huge but, the sources warn that the effect is temporary if you don't combine it with Protocol 2.
Why is that?
Because the self-model is sneaky. It will just transfer its competitive instinct to the new domain. You'll stop comparing your career and start comparing how mindful you are. Look how present I am. I'm so much better at this than those people still on their phones.
You're still burning A to C, it's just wearing a different costume.
Exactly. Which brings us to the final, most integrated approach. Protocol 5, Integrated Pattern Recognition Therapy, or TRP.
This is the synthesis. It blends psychoanalysis, neuroscience, and contemplation for a really deep structural change.
Phase 1 is psychoanalytic. It's about mapping the architecture of your specific self-model. What are the core load-bearing narratives that hold your ego together? I am only valuable when I am productive. I am fundamentally unlovable. You have to see the blueprint first.
Then phase 2 is neuroscientific. This is where it gets really futuristic. You use objective tools like fMRI or EEG to identify the literal neural correlates of those narratives.
You can actually calculate the measurable cost of maintaining that specific story. How many cognitive resources, how much of your day is spent propping up that one belief. It makes the cost concrete and undeniable.
And phase 3 is contemplative. This is the guided, direct observation of how that I is constructed moment by moment. You watch the process of thought generation and self-identification as it happens.
And the goal here is not to eliminate the self. The sources are clear, that's probably impossible, maybe not even a good idea. We need a self to plan for the future.
The goal is to cultivate a non-identified relationship with it.
The self becomes a tool in your toolbox, not the tyrannical king you have to serve. You go from being a prisoner of the self to being the custodian of the self.
Okay, we've laid out this whole system based on energy and psychology, but now we have to get to the really wild part. The reason it's so hard to just decide to stop suffering, for that, we have to shift from psychology to, well, to geometry.
This is where we bring in the independent work of Eric Race and the Phenomenal Manifold Hypothesis, the PMH.
This sounds incredibly abstract. We need a good analogy here. What on earth is a phenomenal manifold?
Okay, think of the totality of your conscious experience right now. Everything you're seeing, hearing, thinking, feeling, as a vast, complex landscape. a kind of inner territory. That landscape is the phenomenal manifold, which they call Sen.
And every distinct possible experience I could have is a specific point, a location in that landscape.
Precisely. And the distance between 2 points in that landscape represents how similar those two experiences are. So the experience of seeing bright red is geometrically closer to seeing orange than it is to the feeling of sadness.
And the shape of this landscape, its size, its complexity, it's not random. It's determined by specific properties of the information processing in your brain.
Right, what the sources call the informational invariants.
Hmm.
Think of them as three main control dials that determine the geometry of your consciousness at any given moment.
Let's break down those dials. Dial number 1 is integration, which they sometimes call analer or violets.
Integration is a measure of how much your brain is working as a single, unified, irreducible whole, rather than just a collection of disconnected parts. High integration means the system is complex and functionally unified.
And if integration collapses, like in deep sleep or under anesthesia, the conscious landscape itself just collapses into a single point.
It basically vanishes. Okay, dial number 2 is global coherence, or a gamma.
Coherence. This measures how well different parts of your brain are oscillating in sync with each other. Are they all humming the same tune?
That's a great way to put it. We can measure it mathematically. It goes from 0, which is total chaos, to 1, which is perfect synchrony.
And the third dial is differentiation, or delta. How is that different from coherence?
If coherence is how well the orchestra is playing together, differentiation is how many different instruments and notes they can play. It's the diversity, the size of the repertoire of all possible mental states you can access.
So high differentiation means lots of complex, distinct thoughts and feelings. Low differentiation means a very simple, unified experience.
Perfect. So the PMH model then defines a rigorous mathematical map from the messy physical state of your brain to this clean, geometric, phenomenal landscape.
And the shape of that landscape, its geometry, is dictated by those three dials: integration, coherence, and differentiation. And the key takeaway is that turning those dials up tends to expand the phenomenal space. It makes the landscape bigger and more complex.
Which gives us this incredible new tool. We can now create a geometric map of different states of consciousness. Each state occupies a distinct region in that landscape, defined by things like its number of dimensions, its curvature, and its total volume.
Okay, so let's map a few. What does ordinary wakefulness look like geometrically?
High integration, moderate coherence, and differentiation. Geometrically, it's a high-dimensional space. The sources estimate somewhere between 8 and 15 dimensions. We're running all these complex social models and thoughts, which creates a moderately curved surface.
And deep sleep. That's the collapse.
The total collapse. Yeah. Low everything. The geometry shrinks down to maybe 1 to 3 dimensions with almost no volume. The landscape basically disappears.
Now for the extremes. Psychedelic states.
That's a massive explosion of differentiation, a huge increase in the diversity of mental content. But often, coherence can go down. The orchestra is playing a million new notes, but they're not all in sync.
And what does that do to the geometry?
It causes a dramatic expansion into regions of very high curvature, potentially 15 to 30 dimensions with a massive increase in volume. The landscape becomes enormous, jagged, and unpredictable.
And on the other end of the spectrum, you have those minimal states like advanced meditative states or deep flow.
Right. Geometrically, this is the opposite. You have very low differentiation. The mental content is simplified down to just the breath or a single sensation. But crucially, you have very high coherence. The whole system is perfectly synchronized.
So the geometry contracts.
It contracts toward a state of low curvature and minimal volume. It's an incredibly efficient, compact, stable geometric structure. A tiny, smooth, powerful landscape.
And this is the moment of convergence. This is the truly mind-blowing part. We have these two completely separate frameworks. One is about energy and psychology, the BDC. The other is about information and geometry, the PMH.
And it turns out they are describing the exact same phenomena, just in two different languages. The psychological is the geometric.
We can actually translate between them. So translation 1, the self model is geometry. That core BDC idea of defensivo, the energy cost of defending your ego.
Translates perfectly into the language of PMH. A state of high defense view corresponds precisely to a region in that phenomenal landscape with high dimensionality, high curvature, and large volume.
Hang on, let me just absorb that. When I'm stuck in a loop, ruminating for hours about something embarrassing I said, defending my fragile ego, I am literally physically increasing the intrinsic dimension and complexity of my conscious space.
You are. You're demanding that your brain render a massive, high-resolution, energetically expensive geometric simulation. You are expanding your problem space.
Which leads to translation 2. Psychological conflict, type 2, has a geometrical signature, that feeling of chronic anxiety, that constant internal chatter and comparison.
Has a precise geometric definition. It's a state of high differentiation, lots of scattered, anxious thoughts, but very low coherence. The brain is fragmented and unsynchronized. Anxiety is the geometry of high diversity without unity.
So the geometric prediction for something like chronic anxiety is a region in this manifold of a huge number of dimensions, maybe 12 to 20, that's highly curved and has a massive volume. It's a chaotic, sprawling, inefficient geometry.
Exactly. And conversely, translation 3. The dissolution of the self is a geometric transition. When someone enters a state of deep flow or non-dual awareness, where that tyrannical I feeling is absent,
They're geometrically transitioning to a state of low differentiation, a simple, unified experience and high coherence, a globally synchronized brain.
this gives us the geometric target for all those contemplative practices. A state with maybe 2 to 5 dimensions, low curvature, and minimal volume. The phenomenal space becomes compact, stable, and incredibly energy efficient. It costs almost no e-defensivo to maintain.
The synthesis lets the sources lay out what they call the 7 laws of conscious geometry. It's like a new physics for the mind.
Law 1 is correspondence.
Right.
It formalizes that energy link. E-defensivo is directly proportional to the product of the geometry. Dimensionality times curvature times volume. The cost of your existence is literally geometric.
Law 2, collapse in pure type 1. When you have to react to a real physical threat, a car swerving towards you, and your response is purely functional with no ego drama.
Die 2, e-defensio drops to 0. And the geometry instantly collapses to a state of minimal volume and near zero curvature. A flat, efficient present moment state, all action, no story.
And the opposite is Law 3, explosion in type 2, chronic anxiety, tribalism, outrage. That's when the self-model hijacks the entire phenomenal space. It results in maximum dimensionality, low coherence, and a massive geometric volume.
Law 4 is the principle of minimum phenomenal volume. This states that the most efficient and least suffering states of consciousness are the ones that maximize integration while minimizing the geometric volume and dimensionality they occupy. They're compact and powerful.
And then there's Law 7, the irreversibility of the expanded self. And this one, for me, is the most practical and honestly the most sobering.
It's the one that explains why change is so hard. It says that once the dimension of your self-model gets stuck above a certain threshold, they gets around 10 dimensions, you can't just think your way back down.
The complexity becomes self-sustaining. Reducing it requires a serious systemic intervention. Thousands of hours of contemplative training or a major life trauma or a powerful pharmacological intervention.
This is why you can read a library full of philosophy, know intellectually that your ego is an illusion and your suffering is self-generated, and still fly into a rage when someone cuts you off in traffic.
Because the intellectual knowledge didn't change the underlying geometric structure. Your phenomenal space is still high-dimensional, rigid, and demanding huge amounts of energy for its defense.
The geometry is the suffering, and you can only change it with geometric work with the protocols.
So what we're looking at here is more than just a theory. It's a framework that's mathematically rigorous and, crucially, it's empirically testable. It's trying to be for consciousness what the discovery of DNA was for biology, a fundamental unifying language.
And its great strength is its falsifiability. It makes concrete predictions, which means it can be proven wrong. That's the hallmark of good science.
For example, the theory fails if we find that long-term advanced meditators do not consistently show that predicted low-dimensional geometry of around 3 to 5 dimensions.
Or if we can't find a strong statistical correlation between the geometric measures dimension, curvature, volume, and people's subjective reports of psychological suffering. If that correlation is weak, the theory is in trouble.
And it also makes differential predictions that separate it from other big theories of consciousness.
Right. PMH predicts that you can keep the total level of integration, or FUMA, stable. But if you change only the coherence and differentiation dials, you will cause massive changes in the geometry and the subjective experience.
Which helps it distinguish between, say, a highly complex anxious state and a highly complex psychedelic state. They might both be complex, but their geometries are completely different. And this opens the door to some truly revolutionary applications.
Geometric technology, diagnosis and intervention.
This is a paradigm shift for clinical mental health. Imagine going to a doctor and instead of just filling out a subjective questionnaire about how anxious you felt last week,
You have a 1-hour EEG or fMRI scan that provides an objective diagnosis of your conscious geometry.
The doctor could literally say to you, your baseline state is a 17-dimensional manifold with high curvature and low global coherence. That's a classic signature for chronic type 2 anxiety. Our goal is to reduce your intrinsic dimension by 10 points and increase your coherence by 30%.
It's objective functional diagnosis, and that means the interventions can become surgical. We already have tools like TCS, but they're often a bit of a blunt instrument. This would allow for neuromodulation guided by geometry.
So instead of just vaguely stimulating a whole brain region, the intervention could be incredibly precise. Target: increase global coherence in the alpha frequency band from zero point 0.4 to zero point 0.7.
And the endpoint isn't subjective anymore. It's a measurable geometric target. We've successfully moved you into the target region of 5 dimensions with a baseline volume of 0.3. It's true consciousness engineering.
This would also completely change how we use powerful tools like psychedelics. They could be assisted by geometry.
You could pre-map someone's problematic geometry. Let's say they have extreme ego rigidity, which might be a state of moderate dimension but very high inflexible curvature.
So you could then optimize the dose of a psychedelic to induce a specific geometric transition, maybe a temporary massive expansion and differentiation, to shatter that rigidity.
And then crucially, you could use post-experience neuromodulation to help stabilize the new, healthier, lower curvature geometry, preventing the person from just snapping back into their old, rigid self-model a week later.
Taking this even further, the sources propose a kind of geometric bill of health for society as a whole.
They suggest creating an index of conscious geometry, IGC, a public health metric that would track the population's average ratio of defensive to functional energy, their average coherence, and their average dimensionality.
Which would force us into a societal redesign. We would have to audit our institutions, our workplaces, our technologies for designs that are actively maximizing a defense.
You could regulate social media algorithms that are shown to reliably increase the average population's dimensionality by more than a certain amount. You could essentially make it illegal to engineer platforms that induce pathological, high-energy type 2 conflict.
And the education system would have to be transformed. You could have a curriculum that starts in high school teaching geometric literacy.
Teaching kids that their inner world has a real, measurable geometry. How to recognize the signature of type 2 conflict in their own experience, and how to use basic non-reactive protocols to reduce their own dimensionality and increase their coherence. It would be as basic as learning about dental hygiene.
Before we wrap up, we have to come back to that central tension, the paradox of all this. Type 1 conflict, that raw material competition for resources. It was the engine of evolution.
It was the sharpening pencil, as the sources put it. It's what drove the development of all the complexity that led to us. The argument is that a life form that had no type 1 conflict would probably have just remained a very simple organism.
Conflict in its material form was necessary for creativity and intelligence to emerge.
But the great human tragedy, the paradox reaffirmed, is that the very intelligence that gave us the edge in type 1 survival accidentally created this monster of type 2 suffering, this massive, chronic internal civil war that, as far as we know, exists nowhere else in the universe.
We are, in a very real sense, the victims of our own evolutionary success.
And the question now is, what do we do about it? The sources lay out 4 possible futures for our civilization based on how we choose to deal with this geometric crisis of type 2 conflict.
Future A is the catastrophic one. They
Yeah.
give it a 35 to 40% probability. Type 2 conflict just continues to grow unchecked.
This leads to runaway mental health epidemics, but also intensified tribalism because we defend our collective egos just as fiercely as our individual ones. And that makes it impossible to cooperate on the big global type 1 crises like climate change. The defensive energy drains all our problem-solving capacity.
Future B is pharmacological management, a 25 to 30% chance. We essentially solve the problem with a pill or a device. We invent technologies that can chemically or electronically silence the excessive self, forcing down the dimensionality and volume.
The risk there is obvious. A potential dystopia of social control, where necessary dissent and creativity, which often require some internal friction, are engineered out of existence in favor of a docile, happy population.
Future C is conscious evolution, the optimistic path. They give us a 20 to 25% chance. This is the widespread adoption of geometric literacy, secular contemplative tools integrated into public health, and a redesign of society based on this evidence.
The benefit would be a massive reduction in unnecessary suffering. And all that freed up defensive energy could be channeled into creativity and solving real type 1 problems.
And finally, feature D, the chaotic hybrid, which they say is the most likely at 40 to 50%.
This is just a messy mix of all three. Some groups, probably the wealthy and educated, achieve a kind of conscious evolution for themselves. Others fragment into high-dimensional, pathological, tribal warfare. And others are managed by pharmacological solutions.
Which would lead to a terrifying new form of inequality, not just a wealth gap, but a conscious health gap, a geometric divide between different segments of the population.
And the whole point of this framework, this synthesis we've been discussing, is that it's a scientifically grounded argument for why we must actively push ourselves toward future C. It's saying we finally have the map and the tools to scientifically choose our future geometry.
So when you boil it all down, what does this all mean? If this framework is even close to correct, it means that the self, the thing that feels like the absolute bedrock of your existence, is actually a contingent, high-energy, high-dimensional geometric structure. And it is not strictly necessary for you to function.
We can never eliminate type 1 conflict. That's just the laws of physics. Entropy and scarcity are here to stay. But we may now, for the first time in history, possess the scientific map and the practical tools to choose to cease type 2 conflict, to end the unnecessary, geometrically expensive internal war.
The sources use a powerful analogy. The self-model isn't the problem. It's a useful tool, like a map. The problem is when you mistake the map for the territory. The problem is dying of thirst while running after a mirage of a perfect self on the horizon, when the real, life-sustaining water was always right here in the direct, unmediated experience of the present moment.
But this choice presents us with one final, profound ethical dilemma, which is where we have to leave it. The self-model, with all its geometric cost and drama, may still be required for certain uniquely human things. Complex, long-term planning, deep moral reasoning, maybe even certain forms of artistic creativity that are born from dissonance and struggle.
So if we develop the technology to precisely measure and modulate the geometry of our own consciousness, to find that sweet spot between the minimal, peaceful state of 3 dimensions and the complex, creative state of 15 dimensions, do we have an ethical obligation to use that technology to keep everyone in that optimal zone? Or is there a fundamental right to high dimensionality, a right to the suffering, the conflict, and the chaotic geometry that might just be inseparable from the capacity to be profoundly, beautifully, and tragically human? That's the geometric choice we're facing.